Ryan Carter slammed his fist on the diner counter so hard the coffee cups rattled. "Say that again," he growled, stepping between his daughter and the man who had just called Olivia Bennett the fat librarian nobody wants. The whole diner went silent. Lily grabbed her father's sleeve, terrified. Olivia stood frozen, humiliated, waiting for Ryan to walk away from her like every other man had. He didn't. He turned to her instead, took her trembling hand in front of everyone, and said the words that would change both their lives forever. But this wasn't even the hardest thing Ryan would have to say to her. Because months later, on a rainy porch, he would try to push her away with 4 words, "You're too good for me." And her answer would break him wide open. If you're watching this from your hometown right now, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story has traveled. And if stories about real love, second chances, and broken people finding each other speak to you, hit subscribe, because this journey is only just beginning. The bell above the diner door was still ringing in Ryan Carter's ears when he realized what he'd just done. He was standing in the middle of Hank's diner, the only diner in the small town of Larkspur, Wyoming, with his hand wrapped around Olivia Bennett's, and every single person in that building was staring at him like he'd lost his mind. Maybe he had. 3 minutes earlier, none of this was supposed to happen. Ryan had walked in with Lily, his 7-year-old daughter, planning to order 2 burgers, sit in their usual booth by the window, and go home. That was the plan. That was always the plan. Ryan didn't do surprises anymore. Surprises had taken his wife from him 5 years ago, and ever since then, he'd built his whole life around routine, because routine didn't hurt you. Routine didn't leave. But then, he'd seen Olivia sitting alone at the counter, and he'd seen Dale Pruitt, a man Ryan had known since high school, a man who'd never worked an honest day of hard labor in his life, lean over from 2 stools down and say something to her that made her shoulders curl inward like she was trying to disappear. Ryan didn't even hear the words at first. He just saw her face. He'd seen that face before, not on Olivia, on himself. In the mirror, the year after Sarah died, when people would say things like, "At least she's not suffering anymore," as if that was supposed to fix anything. He knew what it looked like when someone was being erased in real time, smiled at while being cut down, spoken to, like they weren't fully a person. "What did you say?" Ryan had asked, his voice flat and low. Dale had laughed, not even bothering to look guilty. "Just telling her she ought to thank the library for hiring her is all. Not exactly overflowing with options a girl her size." Lily, standing beside her father, had gone very still. She was 7, but she wasn't stupid. She understood mean when she heard it, even wrapped in a laugh. And that was the moment something in Ryan simply snapped. He didn't remember crossing the diner. He didn't remember his hand hitting the counter. He only remembered the silence afterward, and the shame burning in Dale Pruitt's face, and Olivia's sweet quiet. Olivia Bennett, the librarian who'd spent the last 3 weeks patiently teaching his daughter to read without stumbling over the big words, sitting there with her eyes wide and glassy, like she didn't know whether to run or cry. "Say that again," Ryan had said. "I want to hear you say it again," looking at her instead of laughing about it behind her back. Dale hadn't said it again. Dale had mumbled something about not meaning anything by it and grabbed his hat and left the door slamming behind him hard enough to rattle the glass. And that should have been the end of it. Ryan should have sat down, ordered his burgers, and let the diner go back to its business. Instead, he'd turned to Olivia, who was still sitting there, frozen, waiting. The way people wait when they've learned that kindness is usually followed by an excuse, a but, a slow retreat, and he'd reached out and taken her hand. He didn't plan it. His body did it before his mind caught up. "You okay?" he asked her, quiet enough that it was just for her. Olivia looked down at his hand around hers, like she couldn't quite process that it was real. I'm fine. People say stuff. I'm used to it." "You shouldn't have to be used to it." She looked up at him then, and something in her expression cracked just slightly, like a door that hadn't been opened in years creaking on its hinge. "Most people don't say anything," she said. "It's easier to look away." "I'm not most people," Ryan said. And then hearing how that sounded, he felt his ears go red and let go of her hand like it had caught fire. "Sorry, I didn't mean, I just meant—" "It's okay," Olivia said, and for the first time since he'd walked in, she almost smiled. "Thank you, Ryan." She knew his name. Of course she knew his name. Larkspur had maybe 800 people in it. Everyone knew everyone. But hearing her say it softly, like it meant something to her that he'd stood up that landed somewhere in Ryan's chest, he hadn't expected. Lily tugged on his jacket. "Dad, can Miss Olivia sit with us?" And that was how it started. Not with flowers, not with a date, not with anything either of them would have called romantic if you'd asked them that night. It started with a man's fist on a counter and a little girl's invitation, and a woman who had spent years learning to expect nothing suddenly being handed something she didn't know what to do with. Ryan Carter was 37 years old, and by his own estimation, he had exactly two things left in his life that mattered: his daughter and his work. He ran a small equipment repair shop on the edge of town, fixing tractors and balers and irrigation pumps for farmers who couldn't afford to drive 2 hours to the nearest dealership. It wasn't glamorous work. His hands were permanently stained with grease no soap could fully lift, and his back ached most nights from bending over engines that weren't built to be worked on by one tired man alone. But it was honest, and it paid the bills, and most importantly, it let him be home by 6 most evenings to make dinner for Lily. Sarah had died 5 years ago. Cancer, fast and cruel, the kind that gives you just enough time to say goodbye, but not enough to prepare for what comes after. Lily had been 2 years old. She had no real memories of her mother, only the photographs Ryan kept in a shoebox he couldn't bring himself to put into frames, because putting them into frames felt like admitting she was really gone. And some days 5 years later, he still hadn't fully admitted that. He hadn't dated anyone since. Not once. Not a coffee, not a phone number, nothing. Every well-meaning aunt and church friend who'd tried to set him up over the years had gotten the same answer: "I've got everything I need right here." And he'd nod toward Lily, and that would usually end the conversation, because what were you supposed to say to that? The truth Ryan never said out loud was simpler and harder than that. He didn't think he deserved to be happy again. Somewhere in the wreckage of losing Sarah, he'd absorbed the quiet, poisonous idea that his job now was to survive, to raise his daughter, to keep the lights on, and that wanting more than that, wanting joy for himself, would somehow be a betrayal of the woman he'd buried. He didn't know it yet, but that belief was about to be tested by the last person he expected.
Chapter 10.
Olivia Bennett had moved to Larkspur 4 months earlier to take the assistant librarian position, and if you'd asked anyone in town what they knew about her, they'd have told you 3 things. She was quiet, she was kind to children, and she was heavy. That third fact seemed to matter more to people than it should have. Olivia was 25 years old and weighed close to 220 pounds. A fact she was aware of every single day. Not because she obsessed over it, but because the world made absolutely certain she never forgot it. She'd grown up in a small town, much like this one, the kind of place where everyone's business belonged to everyone, and where a heavy girl learned early that people would form opinions about her character before she'd said a single word. In college, she'd dated exactly 3 men. 2 of them had eventually admitted in almost identical words that they were embarrassed to be seen with her in public. The third had simply stopped calling, and when she'd finally worked up the courage to ask him why, he'd said flatly, "I think you know why, Liv," as though her body were an obvious and sufficient explanation that required no further discussion. After that, Olivia had made a decision that she'd never told anyone about, not even her mother. She decided to stop trying to become beautiful enough for other people's standards, because she had realized slowly, painfully over the course of years that the goalposts would always move. There would always be a smaller number, a smaller size, a version of herself that didn't yet exist and might never exist, and if her worth as a human being was tied to reaching it, she would spend her whole life waiting to be allowed to be loved. So she stopped waiting for that. Instead, she started looking for something else entirely. Not the strongest man in the room, not the richest, not the one with the most charm. She started looking for character. She started paying attention to how men treated waitresses, how they spoke to their mothers on the phone, how they behaved when they thought no one important was watching. She hadn't found it. Not in 4 years, not in 3 towns, not in dozens of almost relationships that fizzled before they ever really began. Until she moved to Larkspur, and a 7-year-old girl named Lily Carter walked into the library on her second week of work, clutching a book 2 grade levels above her reading ability, insisting she could read it herself, and quietly tearfully admitting 20 minutes later that she couldn't. "That's okay," Olivia had told her, crouching down to Lily's eye level. "Reading isn't a race. We just find the right book for right now, and the harder ones will still be here waiting for you when you're ready." Lily had looked at her with the kind of desperate hope only children have. "Will you help me get ready? Every week if you want me to." That was how Olivia met Ryan Carter, not across a counter, not through a mutual friend, but through his daughter, who came home from the library that day and announced at dinner with total 7-year-old conviction, "Miss Olivia is the nicest person I've ever met, and I'm going to marry someone exactly like her when I grow up." Ryan had laughed, ruffled her hair, and thought nothing more of it. He would think about it a great deal more later. Yeah. The weeks after the diner incident changed the rhythm of Ryan's life in ways he didn't fully notice until he looked back on them. Olivia started showing up more. Not aggressively, not in a way that felt like pursuit. She wasn't that kind of person, and honestly, Ryan doubted she believed she had any right to pursue anyone. It was smaller than that. She'd bring an extra casserole dish, because I made too much, and it'll go bad, otherwise, and leave it on his porch with a note. She'd stay 20 minutes late at the library on Tuesdays, when Ryan worked until closing at the shop, and had to bring Lily along to pick up new books just to make sure Lily had time to finish her reading lesson properly. She remembered that Lily's favorite color had changed from pink to green sometime around her 7th birthday. And she remembered the exact day of that birthday, and she showed up to Lily's small backyard party with a book wrapped in green paper and a card that made Lily cry happy tears. "You didn't have to do that." Ryan told her that evening after the other parents had gone, and it was just the 3 of them cleaning up crepe paper and half-eaten cake. "I wanted to," Olivia said simply. "She's important to me." "You're important to her too," Ryan said, and then realizing how that sounded added quickly. "I mean, she talks about you constantly. It's kind of embarrassing, actually. I think she likes you more than she likes me some days." Olivia laughed, a real laugh, warm and a little surprised, like she wasn't used to being the reason someone smiled. "I doubt that very much." "You'd be surprised." There was a pause, then one of those small silences that stretch a beat longer than they should, where 2 people are both aware that something is happening, and neither of them is ready to name it. "Ryan," Olivia said finally, folding a piece of used wrapping paper with more focus than the task required. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Why did you do that at the diner? You didn't know me. You didn't owe me anything." Ryan thought about the question longer than he expected to. "Honestly," he said, "I don't know if I decided to do it. I think I know what it feels like to have people talk about you like you're not in the room. Like your pain is just a topic of conversation instead of something real that's happening to a person right in front of them." He shrugged, uncomfortable the way he always got when a conversation got too close to Sarah without actually mentioning her. "I've had 5 years of people doing that to me. I guess I just didn't want to watch it happen to someone else." Olivia was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry," she said. "About your wife. Lily mentioned her once. I didn't want to bring it up, but I am sorry, Ryan. That's an unimaginable thing to carry." "Yeah," Ryan said. "It is." He looked out at his yard, at the fading light, at his daughter's abandoned birthday decorations swaying gently in the evening breeze. "Some days it's heavier than others. For what it's worth," Olivia said, "I think you're doing an incredible job with her. Lily's one of the happiest, most secure kids I've ever met. That doesn't happen by accident. That happens because someone worked very, very hard to make sure it did." Ryan didn't have a response for that. He wasn't used to being seen that clearly, and it unsettled him in a way he couldn't fully name. Not badly, just unfamiliar, like a muscle he hadn't used in a long time. "Thank you," he finally managed, "for everything you do for her. And I guess for this, too." He gestured vaguely at the cleaned-up yard, the empty cake plates, the ordinary domestic scene that somehow felt significant. "I like being here," Olivia said quietly. "More than I probably should admit." She left shortly after that, and Ryan stood on his porch for a long time after her car pulled away, turning that sentence over in his mind, wondering what exactly she meant by "more than I probably should admit," and wondering with a growing unease why the thought of an answer made his chest feel tight, in a way he hadn't allowed himself to feel in 5 years. What Ryan didn't know, what Olivia had never told anyone in Larkspur, was that she had already fallen in love with him weeks before that conversation on the porch, and that she was terrified of it. It wasn't a dramatic realization. There was no single lightning bolt moment. It had built slowly, the way real things tend to build, out of dozens of small observations that accumulated into a conclusion she hadn't been looking for. She noticed it the first time she watched him help old Mrs. Kowalski carry her groceries from her car to her porch, unasked on his way home from the shop. Still in his grease-stained coveralls, refusing the $5 the older woman tried to press into his hand. She noticed it, the way he talked to Lily, never down to her, never dismissive of her questions, always patient, even when he was clearly exhausted, always making sure she felt heard. She noticed it in the small things nobody else seemed to see, the way he double-checked that the library's ramp was clear of ice every winter morning before opening, not because anyone asked him to, but because he'd noticed an elderly patron struggling with it once and quietly fixed the problem himself without ever mentioning it to a soul. Olivia only found out because Mrs. Whitfield, the head librarian, had mentioned it in passing, assuming Olivia already knew. Ryan Carter didn't perform kindness. He simply was kind in the unglamorous, unwitnessed way that told you it was actually real. And so somewhere in the space of 2 months, without ever deciding to, Olivia had fallen for a man who believed himself unworthy of being fallen for. The problem, the terrifying familiar problem, was that Olivia had been here before. Not with Ryan, never with anyone like Ryan, but she had been in that particular kind of hope before, the kind that convinces you that maybe finally, this time will be different. And every single time before this one, that hope had been answered with the same quiet, devastating rejection, delivered with an apologetic smile, as if her body were a mitigating circumstance that excused whatever cruelty came next. She kept waiting for Ryan to do the same thing. She kept bracing for it. Every warm conversation, every moment of easy laughter between them, she filed away with a small private warning. Don't get used to this. This is temporary. Men like Ryan don't end up with women like you. She told herself that so often that she almost believed it was protecting her. It wasn't. It was only delaying the inevitable moment when both of their fears would collide. That collision came on a rainy evening in early October, 3 months after the diner on Ryan's front porch, after Lily had fallen asleep, and the two of them sat together with mugs of coffee going cold between them, listening to the rain hammer against the tin roof. They'd spent the evening the way they'd spent a dozen evenings, before this one easy, comfortable, full of small laughter about nothing in particular. Olivia recounting a story about a patron who'd tried to return a library book that had clearly been used as a coaster. Ryan telling her about the farmer who'd brought in a tractor engine with an entire bird's nest built inside it. But somewhere in the comfortable quiet that followed, Ryan's smile began to fade, and Olivia watched it happen, watched something heavy settle over him like a fog rolling in off the mountains. "Ryan," she said softly. "You okay?" He looked down into his coffee for a long moment before answering. When he finally spoke, his voice had a rawness to it she hadn't heard before, not even when he'd talked about Sarah. "Olivia, I need to say something, and I need you to actually hear it, not just be polite about it." Her stomach dropped. This was it. This was the moment she'd been bracing for since the day he'd taken her hand in that diner. She set her mug down carefully, as if steadying it might steady her too. "Okay," she said. "I'm listening." Ryan forced something that was supposed to be a smile, but looked more like the expression of a man about to do something he didn't want to do, but believed he had to. "You're too good for me," he said. The words landed exactly the way Olivia had expected them to, and exactly nothing like she'd expected them to both at once. I'm 12 years older than you. Ryan continued, the words coming faster now, like he'd rehearsed them and needed to get through them before he lost his nerve. I'm a widower, with a kid who already lost one mother. I'm not going to risk putting her through losing someone else she loves if I mess this up. I fix broken tractors for a living. I've got grease under my fingernails. I can't get out anymore, and a bank account that keeps me up some nights. And I'm Olivia. I'm tired. I'm tired in a way that goes down deep, and you deserve somebody who isn't. You deserve somebody who has something left to give you that isn't already half spent. He finally looked up at her, and his eyes were wet, and his voice cracked slightly on the last part. You should find someone better than me. Somebody who can actually give you what you deserve. Olivia sat very still for a moment. Every instinct she'd trained into herself over years of disappointment told her to nod, to agree to make this easy for him, the way she'd made it easy for every man before him who'd found a polite way to explain why she wasn't quite enough. That was the script. That was how this always went. But something in her, something that had been quietly growing stronger with every small kindness she'd witnessed from this man over the last 3 months, refused to follow the script this time. She reached out and took his hand the same way he had taken hers that day in the diner, and she looked directly into his eyes, and she said the only thing that felt true. That's exactly why I chose you. Ryan went completely still. What? He said barely above a whisper. You heard me? Olivia said, and her voice, though shaking slightly, didn't waver from what she meant. You just listed every single reason you think disqualifies you from being loved, Ryan, and every single one of those reasons is actually why I fell for you in the first place. Olivia, let me finish, she said gently, but firmly, and something in her tone made him stop. You think being tired disqualifies you. I've watched you come home from 12-hour days at that shop and still have the patience to sit with Lily for an hour, sounding out words with her, never once raising your voice, never once making her feel stupid for struggling. You think being a widower disqualifies you? I think it means you know exactly how precious love is, because you've already lost it once, and that's not a weakness, Ryan. That's the rarest kind of strength there is. Most people go their whole lives without ever loving anyone enough to be devastated by losing them. Her voice cracked slightly, but she kept going. You think I deserve someone richer, someone younger, someone with clean fingernails and an easy life, Ryan. I have spent years being told in a dozen different polite and cruel ways that I'm not enough exactly as I am, that I need to change something about myself before I'm allowed to be loved properly. And I stopped believing that story a long time ago because I realized it was never true. It was just something people said to make their own limitations sound like they were about me. She squeezed his hand. I don't want the strongest man in the world, Ryan. I don't want the richest or the most impressive or the one with the fewest scars. I want someone whose daughter feels completely safe falling asleep beside him. I want someone who still believes in kindness after losing absolutely everything that mattered to him. I want someone who proves love with actions every single day instead of promising it with words he never backs up. Tears were falling freely down her face now, but her voice stayed steady. You are that man, Ryan. You have been that man since the moment you stood up for a stranger in a diner because you couldn't stand to watch her be hurt. So don't you dare tell me you're not good enough for me. You are the only man who has ever made me believe I was allowed to be loved exactly as I am. For a long moment, Ryan said nothing at all. The rain kept falling against the roof. Somewhere inside the house, a floorboard creaked as the old farmhouse settled into the cold October night. Then slowly, carefully, like a man afraid of breaking something precious, Ryan lifted Olivia's hand to his lips and pressed a kiss against her knuckles. I've spent 5 years, he said quietly, telling myself I didn't deserve to feel this again. That wanting to be happy meant I was betraying Sarah somehow. That the safest thing I could do for Lily was keep everything small and controlled and predictable because predictable doesn't leave you. He shook his head slowly. And then you walked into our lives and you didn't just make room for yourself in it, you made both of us better for having you there. I don't know how to say thank you for that in a way that's big enough. You don't have to say thank you, Olivia whispered. You just have to stay. I'm not going anywhere, Ryan said, and for the first time in 5 years, he said it and actually believed it. Neither of them moved for a long moment. The rain continued its steady rhythm against the tin roof, and somewhere in that old farmhouse, two people who had both spent years convincing themselves they didn't deserve to be chosen, finally allowed themselves to be chosen anyway. It wasn't the end of their story. It was barely the beginning. There were still wounds neither of them had spoken aloud, yet Ryan's guilt buried deep and unresolved about loving someone after Sarah. Olivia's years of quiet humiliation that had taught her to expect rejection before it ever arrived. There was still a family to build a town's opinions to weather, and a little girl whose heart was about to become the center of something neither adult had planned for. But on that porch, in the rain, holding hands over 2 cups of cold coffee, Ryan Carter and Olivia Bennett had already done the hardest part. They had chosen each other, not despite everything that made them afraid, but because of it. And nothing that came after would ever be able to take that moment away from them. The rain hadn't stopped by morning, and neither had the quiet current running between them. Ryan woke before sunrise out of habit the way he always did, and for a moment he lay there in the gray half-light trying to figure out why his chest felt different, lighter. Then he remembered the porch, the coffee gone cold. Olivia's hand in his, and the sound of her voice saying, "That's exactly why I chose you." And he had to press the heel of his palm against his eyes, because he was 37 years old, and he was not going to cry over a memory before he'd even had breakfast. He heard small feet on the stairs before he heard the words. "Dad!" Lily stood in his doorway, in her pajamas, hair sticking up in 6 directions, staring at him with the particular intensity only a 7-year-old can produce before 8 in the morning. "Is Miss Olivia your girlfriend now?" Ryan sat up so fast he nearly fell out of bed. How do you even know that word? Everybody knows that word, Dad. Lily rolled her eyes with the theatrical patience of a child who believed her father to be at times a little slow. "I heard you guys on the porch last night. I wasn't sleeping. I was listening at the top of the stairs." "Lily." "You held her hand," Lily said, undeterred, climbing onto the foot of his bed and folding her legs underneath her like this was a courtroom and she intended to get answers. "And she cried. And you said you weren't going anywhere. That's what people say in movies right before they kiss. We didn't." Ryan started, then stopped because arguing the technicalities with a 7-year-old was a battle he was never going to win. He exhaled. "Would it bother you if Miss Olivia was more than just your reading tutor?" Lily considered this with the gravity of a Supreme Court justice. "Would she still help me read?" "Every day, probably, if you asked her." "Would she still make the casserole with the cheese on top?" "I'd imagine so." "Then no," Lily said, satisfied, already sliding off the bed toward the door. "I already told you. I'm going to marry someone exactly like her when I grow up. Might as well get a head start and have her around now." She left the room like she'd just closed an important business deal, and Ryan sat there alone, laughing quietly into his hands, feeling something loosen in his chest that had been clenched tight for 5 straight years. He should have known the ease of that morning wouldn't last. Larkspur was a small town, and small towns did not let anything interesting stay quiet for long. By Wednesday, word had gotten out. Ryan heard it secondhand, the way you hear most things in a town of 800 people, through his cousin Mark, who ran the feed store, who mentioned it while ringing up a bag of chicken feed, like it was the most casual piece of information in the world. "Heard Dale's telling folks you took up with the librarian." Mark said, not quite meeting Ryan's eyes. "Heard he's saying some things about her too. Not real flattering things." Ryan's jaw tightened. "What kind of things?" Mark hesitated, and that hesitation told Ryan everything he needed to know before a single word came out. "He's saying she's after your shop," Mark said finally. "Saying a girl like that doesn't end up with a guy like you unless there's something in it for her. Property, mostly. Some folks are saying she's got her eye on the business, seeing as you don't have a will drawn up and Lily's too young to inherit clean." For a long moment, Ryan didn't say anything at all. The rage that moved through him wasn't loud this time. It wasn't the diner counter kind of fury that made him slam his fist down in front of a room full of witnesses. This was colder, quieter, the kind that settled into his bones and stayed there. "That's a lie," Ryan said. "I know that," Mark said quickly. "Everybody with sense knows that. But you know how this town is. A lie gets repeated enough times people start treating it like it's just information, facts on the ground." Ryan drove to the shop that afternoon with his hands too tight on the wheel, and he didn't say a word to Olivia about it, because he didn't know how to say it without sounding like he was accusing her of something, without somehow making her carry the weight of a rumor she hadn't started and didn't deserve. That was his first mistake. Olivia found out on her own 2 days later from an elderly patron at the library who meant well and had absolutely no idea what she was doing when she leaned over the returns desk and said gently conspiratorially, "You be careful with that Carter boy, sweetheart. Folks in town are saying you might be looking for more than love, if you catch my meaning. I don't believe it myself, mind you, but people talk." Olivia's hands had gone very still on the keyboard. She smiled because that was what she'd learned to do. Smile through it, absorb it. Let it slide off like water off glass, so nobody would ever know it had landed somewhere and stayed. But the moment the woman walked away, Olivia excused herself to the back office, closed the door, and sat down on an overturned crate of donated books and let herself feel for exactly 90 seconds the full weight of what she'd just heard. A girl like that doesn't end up with a guy like you unless there's something in it for her. She knew that story. She'd lived that story before in a different town with a different man, and it had ended with her standing alone at the front of a church in a dress she'd never get to wear, listening to whispers about how she'd probably done something to drive him off, because surely it couldn't have been about him. She wiped her eyes, straightened her blouse, and walked back out to the returns desk like nothing had happened. That was her first mistake. By the time Ryan showed up at the library that evening to pick up Lily, Olivia had already rebuilt every wall she'd spent 3 months carefully taking down for him brick by brick, without saying a single word to him about why. "You've been quiet," Ryan said, watching her stamp due dates onto a stack of returns with more force than the task required. "I'm fine," Olivia said. "Busy day." "Olivia." "I said I'm fine, Ryan." Her voice came out sharper than she intended, and she saw him flinch slightly and immediately hated herself for it. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to snap." "Something happened," Ryan said. It wasn't a question. She looked at him for a long moment, weighing whether to tell him, weighing whether telling him would make it real in a way she wasn't ready for, or whether not telling him would just be one more brick in the wall she was already quietly rebuilding. "People are saying things about me," she finally admitted. "About us. About why I'd want to be with you." Ryan's face went pale. "Olivia, I already heard. Mark told me on Wednesday. I should have said something. I didn't know how to bring it up without making it worse." "You knew." Something in Olivia's chest went cold. "You knew, and you didn't tell me, Ryan. I found out from a stranger at my own desk. I found out, and I had 90 seconds alone in a supply closet to fall apart before I had to come back out here and pretend everything was fine. I didn't want you to feel like you had to defend yourself against something so stupid," Ryan said, and even as the words left his mouth, he could hear how badly they were landing. "I was trying to protect you from it. You don't get to decide what I need protecting from," Olivia said, her voice trembling now, the wall crumbling into something rawer, angrier. "I have spent my whole life having people decide on my behalf what I can handle and what I can't, what I deserve to know and what I don't. I don't need you doing it too." The library had gone very quiet around them. Somewhere in the children's section, Lily had stopped flipping through a picture book and was watching the two adults with wide, uncertain eyes. "You're right," Ryan said quietly, after a long moment. "I'm sorry. I should have told you the second I heard." "Why didn't you?" Ryan hesitated, and in that hesitation, something honest finally surfaced. "Because I was scared," he admitted. "I was scared that if I told you, you'd start wondering if maybe they had a point. That maybe you deserve someone whose life doesn't come with this much noise attached to it." Olivia's anger faltered just slightly at the rawness in his voice. "Ryan, that's not—" "Let me finish," he said, echoing her own words from the porch 3 days earlier. "I know what this town can do to people it decides to talk about. I watched it happen after Sarah died, the whispers about whether I was grieving right, whether I was moving too fast or not fast enough, whether Lily was doing okay, or whether I was failing her. I know how ugly it gets. And the idea of you having to carry that too because of me." He shook his head. "I didn't handle it right. I should have told you. I'm sorry." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Lily, sensing the storm had passed its peak, quietly returned to her book, though she kept glancing up every few seconds to make sure. "I need you to promise me something," Olivia said finally. "Anything. Don't protect me by keeping secrets. Protect me by standing next to me while I face things. That's what I need. Not a shield, a partner." Ryan nodded slowly. "Okay," he said. "I promise." It was a small moment in the grand scheme of everything that would come later, but it mattered more than either of them realized at the time, because it was the first real test of whether what they'd found on that rainy porch could survive contact with the outside world, and they had passed it barely by choosing honesty over comfort. They would need that lesson again very soon in a much harder way. Diane Whitmore arrived in Larkspur on a Friday afternoon in late October, driving 4 hours from Casper in a sedan so clean it looked freshly washed despite the dusty roads, and she did not call ahead. She was Sarah's mother, and she had been Lily's only living grandparent since Ryan's own parents had passed years before Sarah ever entered his life, and she came to Larkspur twice a year like clockwork to see her granddaughter, and to quietly, carefully, without ever saying so directly, check on whether Ryan was still keeping Sarah's memory properly honored. Ryan loved Diane. He genuinely did. She had been kind to him in the worst year of his life, had driven up every other weekend for the first 6 months after Sarah died, just to hold Lily so Ryan could sleep, had never once made him feel like he was failing, even when he felt certain he was. But Diane also carried her grief like armor, sharp-edged and defensive, and Ryan had learned over 5 years exactly which subjects to approach carefully around her. He had not, however, anticipated that Olivia would be standing in his kitchen apron on pulling a pan of cornbread out of the oven when Diane's sedan pulled into the driveway unannounced. "Grandma!" Lily shrieked, abandoning her spot at the kitchen table and running for the door before Ryan could even process what was happening. Diane swept into the house with the easy confidence of someone who had never once considered that she might not be welcome, scooping Lily into a hug, and then she looked up, and her eyes landed on Olivia, standing at the stove in an apron that had until recently belonged to Sarah. The silence that followed lasted only 3 seconds, but it felt considerably longer to everyone in the room. "I'm sorry," Diane said, her voice pleasant in the specific way that meant it was not pleasant at all. "I didn't realize you had company, Ryan." "Diane, this is Olivia," Ryan said, stepping forward quickly. "Olivia, this is Diane, Sarah's mother, Lily's grandmother." Olivia wiped her hands on the apron. Sarah's apron, she realized with a jolt, though she had no way of knowing that when she'd grabbed it off the hook that morning and extended a hand. "It's so nice to finally meet you. Lily talks about you all the time." Diane shook her hand with the briefest possible contact, her eyes flicking just once down and up Olivia's frame in a way that lasted less than a second, but somehow managed to say everything. "Likewise," Diane said. Dinner that evening was by any objective measure a disaster wrapped in the appearance of politeness. Diane asked Olivia a series of questions that sounded on the surface perfectly reasonable. "Where are you from? How long have you lived here? What does your family do?" But each one carried an undertone. Olivia recognized immediately. The same undertone she'd spent years learning to detect in half a second. The quiet subtext of what exactly are your intentions, and are you sure you're equipped to carry them out? "And how long have you and Ryan been whatever this is?" Diane finally asked, setting down her fork with deliberate precision. "A few months," Olivia said carefully. "That's quick," Diane said, "considering Sarah's only been gone 5 years. The table went silent. Lily, sensing tension, she was too young to fully understand, but old enough to feel, stopped chewing and looked between the adults. Diane, Ryan said, a warning note entering his voice. I'm only saying. Diane continued her composure, never fully cracking, that Sarah was a very particular kind of woman. Elegant, disciplined, she took excellent care of herself right up until the end. I suppose I'm curious what drew you to someone so... She paused, as if searching delicately for the right word, though everyone at the table understood exactly what word she was avoiding. Different. Diane, that's enough, Ryan said, his voice hard now. It's all right, Olivia said quietly, though her hands had gone tight in her lap beneath the table. I understand the question, Diane. What drew me to Ryan was watching him carry his grief for you, without ever once making it your daughter's burden to fix. What drew him to me, you'd have to ask him. But I can tell you that neither of us is trying to replace anyone. There isn't a version of Sarah I'm supposed to be measured against. I'm just trying to love this family for exactly what it is. Diane's jaw tightened, but she said nothing further, and the rest of dinner passed in a strained, brittle silence, broken only by Lily's determined attempts to fill the quiet with chatter about her reading lessons. Later that night, after Diane had gone to bed in the guest room and Lily was finally asleep, Ryan found Olivia sitting alone on the back steps, wrapped in one of his old flannel shirts against the cold, staring out at nothing. I'm sorry, he said, sitting down beside her. That was unacceptable. I should have shut it down the second she started. You did shut it down, Olivia said. Eventually. Not fast enough. Olivia was quiet for a long moment. She's not wrong to be protective of Lily, she finally said. I understand where it's coming from, even if it hurt. That doesn't make it okay. No, Olivia agreed. It doesn't. But Ryan, I need you to understand something. This is going to keep happening. Not just with Diane. With this whole town. There is always going to be someone measuring me against some version of what I'm supposed to look like, supposed to be. And I can survive that. I've survived it my whole life. What I can't survive is you flinching every time it happens, wondering if maybe they're onto something. I'm not flinching, Ryan said. I chose you. I meant it. Then act like it. Olivia said, not unkindly, but with a steadiness that left no room for argument. Fully, not carefully, not in a way designed to keep the peace with everyone around us. Fully. Ryan reached over and took her hand, the same gesture that had started everything 3 months earlier in a diner full of strangers. Fully, he agreed. It would take exactly 2 more days for that promise to be tested in a way neither of them could have predicted. Diane extended her visit through the weekend, ostensibly to spend more time with Lily, though the tension in the house had thickened into something almost unbearable by Sunday afternoon. Ryan had gone to the shop for a few hours to finish an emergency repair job, leaving Lily in Diane's care, and Olivia had come by after her library shift to drop off books for Lily's reading practice, expecting to simply leave them on the porch and go. She never got the chance. She heard the crash before she saw it, a sharp cracking sound from the backyard followed immediately by Lily's scream. Olivia was through the gate before she'd even fully processed moving, and what she found stopped her heart cold. Lily lay on the ground beneath the old oak tree, her bicycle overturned beside her, her arm bent at an angle that no 7-year-old's arm should ever bend, her face white with shock and pain, screaming in a way that didn't even sound like crying anymore. It sounded like pure animal panic. Diane stood a few feet away, frozen, her hands pressed to her mouth, clearly in some kind of shock of her own. Diane! Olivia shouted, dropping to her knees beside Lily. Diane, call 911 right now. Diane didn't move. Her eyes were wide, unfocused, locked on Lily's arm, and for one horrifying second, Olivia realized the older woman was somewhere else, entirely trapped, perhaps in a memory of another hospital, another emergency, another loss she hadn't fully processed. Diane, Olivia's voice cracked like a whip. I need you present right now. Lily needs us. Call 911. Something in the sharpness of her tone broke through, and Diane fumbled for her phone with shaking hands. Olivia turned back to Lily, forcing every ounce of panic in her own chest down into something calm and steady, because Lily needed calm right now more than she needed anything else in the world. Hey, hey, look at me, Olivia said, taking Lily's uninjured hand gently. Look right at me, sweetheart. I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere. It hurts, Lily sobbed. It hurts so much. I know, baby. I know it does. You're being so brave right now. Braver than almost any kid I've ever met. Olivia kept her voice low, steady, a lifeline. Can you tell me your favorite book, the one we read together last week? The one about the fox? Lily hiccuped through tears. That's right. Tell me what happens at the beginning, just the beginning. Talk to me about it. It was a trick Olivia had learned years ago in a completely different context, working part-time at a children's hospital library during her college years. Distraction as anesthesia, story as anchor. Lily, trembling and sobbing, began haltingly recounting the plot of a picture book. And it was enough, just enough to keep her present. Keep her from spiraling further into the panic of pain and fear, until the ambulance sirens finally became audible in the distance. Ryan arrived at the emergency room 11 minutes after Olivia's frantic call reached him at the shop. His hands still stained with engine grease, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. He found Lily in a hospital bed, her arm already in a temporary splint, tear-streaked but calm, holding tightly to Olivia's hand while a nurse checked her vitals. Dad? Lily's face lit up despite the pain, and Ryan crossed the room in 3 strides and gathered her as gently as he could into his arms. I'm here, baby. I'm here. What happened? I fell off my bike, Lily said. It really hurts, Dad, but Olivia stayed with me the whole time. She told me the fox story until the ambulance came. Ryan looked up at Olivia over his daughter's head, and what he saw in her face, the exhaustion, the fear only now beginning to drain out of her. Now that Lily was safe, the sheer relief nearly undid him completely. It was Diane's reaction, though, that neither of them expected. The older woman had followed them to the hospital in her own car, and she stood now near the doorway of the exam room, unusually quiet, watching the scene in front of her with an expression Olivia had never seen on her face before. She kept her calm the entire time, Diane said quietly, almost to herself. I froze. I completely froze, and she just knew exactly what to do. Diane. Olivia started gently. You were in shock. That's a normal response. No, Diane said, shaking her head slowly, tears now welling in her own eyes. You don't understand. The last time I saw someone I loved lying on the ground like that, it was Sarah at the end, and I couldn't do anything then either. I couldn't fix it. I couldn't save her. And when I saw Lily fall, all I could think was, not again, not again, I can't watch this happen again, and I just froze completely useless while you took care of her. The exam room went quiet, except for the soft beeping of a monitor. I've been so unfair to you, Diane continued, her composure finally fully cracking. I've been measuring you against Sarah since the moment I met you, as though loving Ryan and Lily the way you clearly do is somehow a competition, as though there's only room in this family for one kind of woman to matter. And today, you proved in the worst possible way exactly what kind of person you are, and I am ashamed of how I've treated you. Olivia's throat tightened. Diane, you don't have to. Let me finish, Diane said, echoing without knowing it the exact words Ryan had used on the porch weeks earlier. I was scared. Not of you exactly. Scared that if this family found happiness that didn't include me holding on to Sarah's memory as tightly as I have, then somehow I'd lose the last piece of my daughter I have left. That's not fair to you. It was never fair to you. I'm sorry. Olivia crossed the room and without hesitation wrapped Diane in a hug the older woman clearly wasn't expecting, but didn't pull away from either. You haven't lost anything, Olivia said quietly. You're Lily's grandmother. That doesn't change. That will never change no matter what happens with Ryan and me. I promise you that. For the first time since her arrival 4 days earlier, Diane allowed herself to cry openly right there in the hospital hallway, and something between the two women shifted permanently in that moment. Not fully healed, not yet, but no longer at war. Ryan watched all of it from beside Lily's bed, and he understood with sudden and complete clarity that the woman standing across the room had just done something he himself had failed to do consistently. Over the last 5 years, she had faced the family's grief head-on, without flinching, without retreating into silence, or routine, or the comfortable numbness of avoidance. He thought about that a great deal in the days that followed, as Lily's arm healed in its cast covered in colorful signatures, and as Diane extended her visit by another full week spending long afternoons with Olivia at the library, the two of them slowly, carefully building something neither of them had expected. Not quite friendship yet, but the beginning of it. But peace. Ryan was learning rarely arrived without cost. And the cost of this particular peace was about to reveal itself in a conversation he was never supposed to overhear. It happened on a quiet Tuesday evening, nearly 2 weeks after the hospital, while Ryan was in the garage finishing paperwork for the shop, and Olivia sat with Diane on the back porch, unaware that the kitchen window above them was cracked open, just enough to carry their voices clearly into the garage below. "I worry about him," Diane was saying, her voice low, thoughtful. "Ryan, I mean. He spent 5 years building a life so small and careful that nothing could hurt him again. And now here you are, and Lily loves you, and I can see how happy he is. But I worry that if this doesn't work, if something goes wrong between you two, it will break him in a way he might not recover from this time." Ryan froze where he stood, paperwork forgotten in his hands. "I worry about that too," Olivia admitted quietly. "Some days I think the kindest thing I could do is leave before either of us gets in too deep. Before Lily gets in too deep. Before it's a wound instead of just a bruise." "Do you love him?" Diane asked bluntly. There was a long pause. "More than I've ever loved anyone," Olivia finally said. "Which terrifies me more than anything else in this world." Ryan's chest tightened, torn between the overwhelming relief of hearing those words and the creeping dread of what Olivia had said immediately before them. "The kindest thing I could do is leave." He didn't hear the rest of the conversation, because at that exact moment, his phone rang with an emergency call from a farmer whose combine had broken down mid-harvest, and duty pulled him away before he could process what he'd overheard, before he could walk out onto that porch and demand clarity, before he could do anything at all except carry those 2 sentences around in his chest for the rest of the night like a stone he couldn't put down. He didn't sleep that night. He lay awake, turning Olivia's words over and over, unable to separate the fear from the love in them, unable to know which one would ultimately win. The next morning, he found Olivia at the library before opening hours, sitting alone at her desk, and he didn't bother with preamble. "I heard you," he said. "Last night on the porch with Diane. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, the window was open, and I heard you say you think the kindest thing might be to leave." Olivia's face went pale. "Ryan? Is that true?" he asked, his voice raw. "Do you actually believe that? Because 3 weeks ago you sat on my porch and told me you chose me fully, completely, and I believed you. I built something on believing you. Was I wrong to—" "You weren't wrong," Olivia said quickly, standing up from her desk. "Ryan, listen to me. Fear doesn't erase love. It just sits right beside it sometimes, especially when the love is this big and this new and this important. I love you. That hasn't changed for 1 single second. But loving you also means being terrified that I could somehow hurt you and Lily worse than either of you have already been hurt. And that fear doesn't just disappear because I've decided you're worth it." "Then talk to me about it," Ryan said, echoing deliberately this time the promise she'd extracted from him weeks earlier. "Don't process it with Diane on a porch behind my back. Talk to me." Olivia's eyes filled with tears. "You're right," she said. "I'm sorry. I did exactly what I asked you not to do. I let fear make a decision I should have made out loud with you instead of quietly on my own. So make it out loud," Ryan said, closing the distance between them. "Right now, tell me what you actually want." Olivia looked up at him, and for the first time in weeks, something in her expression settled resolute and certain. "I want to stay," she said. "I want to stay so badly it scares me more than anything ever has. I want Lily's cast covered in my signature too. I want to keep making that stupid casserole every Tuesday until it stops being stupid and starts being tradition. I want to fall asleep on that porch with you every single rainy night for the rest of my life, and I want to stop being so afraid of how much I want it." Ryan pulled her into his arms, and she let him, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything at all, because there was nothing left that needed saying. "Then stay," Ryan whispered into her hair. "Fully. No more porches with anyone but me." "Fully," Olivia agreed. Outside the library window, the first frost of the season had settled over Larkspur, overnight, coating the fields in a thin, glittering white that would melt away by noon. But inside, something far more permanent had just taken root. Something that no rumor, no grief, no fear inherited from old wounds would be strong enough to uproot. Diane left for Casper 3 days later, hugging Olivia tightly at the door and whispering something in her ear that made Olivia laugh through fresh tears. And though neither of them ever repeated exactly what was said, Ryan noticed that from that day forward, Diane called Olivia every single week, just to talk the way you call someone who has become family, whether the paperwork says so yet or not. Winter settled over Larkspur slowly, the way it always did, turning the roads to ice and the evenings to early darkness. And through all of it, Ryan and Olivia built something steady between them, not without arguments, not without moments of doubt, but always, always choosing honesty over the comfortable silence that had nearly cost them everything twice already. Neither of them knew yet that the hardest test of all was still waiting for them, buried in a part of Olivia's past. She had never fully told anyone, a wound so deep she had spent years convincing herself it no longer mattered, until the day it walked back into Larkspur, uninvited, wearing a familiar face neither of them expected to see again. 2 days after Diane's car disappeared down the county road toward Casper, a black company sedan Olivia didn't recognize pulled into the gravel lot outside the Larkspur Public Library, and the moment she saw the man who stepped out of it, her whole body went cold before her mind even caught up to why. Grant Sullivan. She hadn't said that name out loud in almost 4 years. She hadn't let herself think it in nearly as long, not because she'd healed from it exactly, but because she'd gotten very good at closing doors and nailing them shut behind her. And now, here he was walking across the gravel lot in a gray suit that fit him better than anything he'd owned back in college, carrying a leather portfolio under one arm, like he belonged somewhere important, heading straight for the library's front doors. Olivia's hands froze on the keyboard. "Ms. Bennett," Mrs. Whitfield, the head librarian, called from the back office. "There's a state funding representative here for the quarterly budget review. Can you pull the circulation reports for the last 2 quarters? Olivia's stomach dropped through the floor. Of course it was him. Of all the small, cruel coincidences the universe could arrange, this was the one it had chosen. The man who'd once told her flatly, without apology, that he thought she knew exactly why he'd stopped calling, was now standing in her workplace, wearing a state government lanyard, holding the literal fate of her library's budget in his hands. "Olivia," Grant said, stepping up to the desk, his voice carrying the same easy, practiced charm she remembered from 4 years earlier. The kind of charm that had once made her believe, briefly foolishly, that she was special to him. "Wow, I had no idea you'd ended up all the way out here." "Grant." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "You're with the state now. Regional Library Funding Office, 3 years running." He smiled, and it was the same smile, the one that had never once carried real warmth behind it, only calculation. "Small world, huh?" "Incredibly small," Olivia said, and pulled up the circulation reports with hands that were thankfully no longer shaking by the time she handed them over. For the first 20 minutes, it was almost bearable. Grant reviewed numbers, asked professional questions about patron traffic and program attendance, and Olivia answered them with a crisp efficiency that surprised even herself, riding the thin, sharp edge of adrenaline that comes from forcing your body to behave normally while your mind screams at you to run. Then he set down his pen, leaned back slightly, and looked at her in a way that made every muscle in her body tense at once. "You look good, Liv," he said. "Really good, actually. You've changed." There it was. The exact sentence delivered with the exact tone that told Olivia everything she needed to know about how little Grant Sullivan had actually changed in 4 years. "I've changed a lot," Olivia said carefully. I'm a different person than I was in college. I can see that. His eyes moved over her not aggressively, not obviously, but in a way that felt like being catalogued, assessed, measured against some invisible standard he'd apparently decided she'd finally met. You seem happier, more confident. It suits you. Thank you, Olivia said, because there was nothing else to say that wouldn't require an argument. She didn't have the energy to start in the middle of a budget review. I always thought you had potential, you know, Grant continued, oblivious, or perhaps not oblivious at all, perhaps entirely deliberate to how each word was landing. I just thought back then that you needed to figure some things out first. Priorities. That kind of thing. Something in Olivia's chest went very, very still. Figure out what things, Grant. He shrugged the gesture careless, the way a man shrugs when he's about to say something cruel and genuinely believes he's being generous. You know, yourself, your health. I always cared about you, Liv. I wanted better for you than where you were headed. You wanted better for me, Olivia repeated slowly. So you stopped returning my calls and told me when I finally cornered you about it that I already knew why. Grant had the decency, at least, to look slightly uncomfortable. That was a long time ago. I was young. We both said things. You said one thing. Olivia interrupted, her voice low, but no longer shaking, no longer uncertain. I didn't say anything, Grant. I asked you a question and you answered it with 4 words that took me over a year to fully recover from. There's a difference between us both having said things and you saying something cruel and me simply asking to understand it. For a moment, the professional mask slipped from Grant's face entirely, and something flickered underneath it. Not quite guilt, but something adjacent to it. Something that suggested he'd never actually processed what those 4 words had cost her, because he'd never had to live with the consequences the way she had. I didn't come here to relitigate college, he said, finally straightening his tie. I came here to review your library's budget and honestly, Liv, I have some concerns. The shift in his tone was so abrupt, so calculated, that Olivia felt the ground tilt beneath her a second time in the span of 10 minutes. What kind of concerns? Your circulation numbers are down 8% from last year. Program attendance in the children's section is inconsistent. And frankly, for a library this size in a town this small, the state's been asking hard questions about whether continued full funding is justified or whether Larkspur might be better served by a reduced satellite model with the bulk of resources consolidated at the county branch 40 minutes away. Olivia's blood ran cold. That would functionally close this library. It would restructure it, Grant said in the careful, bloodless language of someone reading from a memo rather than considering the actual human consequences of what he was describing. I'm not saying it's decided. I'm saying it's on the table, and my recommendation carries significant weight in that decision. The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but unmistakable, and Olivia felt something cold and furious settle low in her stomach as she understood with total clarity exactly what kind of conversation this had just become. Are you telling me, she said slowly, that my library's funding depends on how I handle a personal conversation with you? I'm not saying that at all, Grant said quickly, his eyes flicking briefly toward Mrs. Whitfield's closed office door. I'm just saying it wouldn't hurt for us to catch up properly. Dinner, maybe, while I'm in town for the review. I'll be here through the weekend finalizing the report. There it was. Not a threat. Not explicitly, never explicitly, because men like Grant Sullivan had learned long ago exactly how to leave themselves deniability while still making their meaning unmistakably clear. I have plans this weekend, Olivia said. With the boyfriend. Grant's smile turned faintly amused, faintly condescending. Small towns talk, Liv. I heard about him on my way in. The mechanic with the kid. That's sweet, I guess. Not exactly what I pictured for you, but sweet. Olivia stood up from her desk, her chair scraping back hard against the floor. Ryan is not sweet, I guess, she said, her voice suddenly hard as flint. Ryan is the best man I have ever known in my life. And the fact that you can't imagine why someone would choose him over the kind of man you turned out to be, Tells me everything I ever needed to know about the difference between the two of you." Grant's expression flickered wounded pride, showing briefly beneath the polished exterior. "I came here to do my job, Liv, and to be honest, I was trying to do you a favor by keeping this conversation friendly." "There's nothing friendly about tying my library's funding to whether I have dinner with you," Olivia said. "I think you should finish your review with Mrs. Whitfield directly from this point forward." She walked away from the desk before he could respond, her legs shaking, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat, and she didn't stop walking until she was in the back stairwell out of sight, where she finally allowed herself to lean against the cold concrete wall and breathe. She didn't tell Ryan that evening. Not because she was hiding it from him. She'd learned that lesson too hard, too recently to make that mistake twice. But because she genuinely didn't know how to say it out loud yet, without her voice breaking, and Lily was there, and she wanted one more ordinary evening before the storm, she could feel gathering finally broke. It broke 2 days later on a Thursday in the worst possible way. Ryan had come by the library to drop off a book Lily had finished, and he was still in the parking lot buckling Lily into her booster seat when he saw a man in a gray suit walk out of the library entrance directly toward him with a confidence that immediately put Ryan's guard up. "You must be Ryan," the man said, extending a hand Ryan didn't take. "Grant Sullivan, old friend of Olivia's from college." Something in the way he said "old friend" made the hair on the back of Ryan's neck stand up. "Can I help you with something?" Ryan asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Just wanted to introduce myself." Grant smiled, glancing briefly at Lily in her booster seat before looking back at Ryan. "Cute kid. Olivia mentioned her. Actually, Olivia's mentioned a lot about you two over the years. We used to talk about what she wanted in a family back when we were together. Guess it's funny how things turn out." Ryan's jaw tightened. "I wasn't aware Olivia was still in contact with you." "Oh, she's not really. Not until this week." Grant's smile widened slightly, and Ryan felt with total certainty that this man was enjoying himself. "I'm doing the state's funding review for her library, actually. Small world. Gave us a lot to catch up on." "Is that right? She's doing well?" Grant continued, apparently unable to resist twisting the knife a little further. "Looks great, actually. I told her that. I always said she had real potential if she just, well, you know how it is. People change." Ryan's hands curled into fists at his sides, the same instinctive fury he'd felt in Hank's diner 3 months earlier, flooding back into his chest, sharper now, more focused, because this time he understood exactly what kind of cruelty he was looking at. "I think you should leave," Ryan said quietly. "I'm just being friendly," Grant said, holding his hands up in mock surrender, though his smile never wavered. "No hard feelings. I'll be around town through the weekend finishing up the review. Tell Olivia I said the offer for dinner still stands if she changes her mind." He walked back toward his sedan without waiting for a response, and Ryan stood in the parking lot for a long moment, his whole body vibrating with a fury he hadn't felt in years, trying to process what he'd just heard and what exactly it meant. The offer for dinner still stands. What offer? What dinner? And why hadn't Olivia mentioned a single word about any of this? He drove home that evening in a fog, dropping Lily off with a babysitter for an hour, under the thin excuse of an emergency shop repair, and drove straight to Olivia's small rented house on the edge of town, his mind spinning through every worst possible interpretation of what he'd just witnessed. Olivia opened the door before he even knocked, having heard his truck pull up, and one look at his face told her exactly what had happened. "You talked to Grant," she said. "Grant," Ryan repeated, his voice tight. "So you do know him? He said he's an old friend from college. He said you two used to talk about what you wanted in a family. He said something about a dinner offer still standing. Olivia, what is going on?" "Come inside," Olivia said quietly. "I'll explain everything. I should have told you 2 days ago. I'm sorry." Ryan stepped inside, and Olivia closed the door behind him. And for the next 20 minutes, she told him everything about college, about the 3 men who'd come before him, about Grant, specifically about the 4 words that had ended things between them years ago, about the state funding review, about the implied threat, about the dinner invitation tied unmistakably to her library's future. By the time she finished, Ryan's hands were shaking, but not with the confused fury he'd carried into the house. Now it was something colder, sharper, more dangerous. "He's tying your funding to a date with him," Ryan said slowly, as if saying it out loud might reveal it to be less true than it actually was. "He never said it directly," Olivia said. "He's too careful for that. But yes, that's exactly what he's doing." "That's extortion." "I know. I want to go find him right now," Ryan said, standing up so fast the chair nearly toppled behind him. "I want to walk into whatever motel he's staying at and do what Ryan," Olivia said, standing too, catching his arm. "Hit him, threaten him, that plays directly into exactly the story he'd love to tell about you. The unstable mechanic boyfriend who assaulted a state official. It would destroy you, it would destroy the shop, and worst of all, it would give him every excuse he needs to recommend the funding cuts anyway out of pure spite. Then what do you want me to do?" Ryan's voice cracked with frustration, with helplessness, with the specific rage of loving someone and having no acceptable outlet for the fury their pain created in you. "Just stand here and let him get away with it." "No," Olivia said, and something steely settled into her expression. Something Ryan recognized from the rainy porch months earlier, the same unshakable resolve she'd shown when she'd refused to let him push her away. "We're going to do this the right way. We're going to document everything. Every word he said, every implication, every single detail, and we're going to report it not to him, not through some quiet backroom conversation, but formally to the State Library Board with witnesses if we can get them." Witnesses. Mrs. Whitfield was in the building. She might have overheard part of it, and I'm willing to bet I'm not the only librarian in this state Grant Sullivan has pulled this kind of thing on. Men like him don't do this once. They have a pattern. We just need to find it. Ryan looked at her for a long moment, something between awe and fierce protectiveness moving through his chest. "How are you this calm right now?" "I'm not calm," Olivia admitted, her voice finally briefly cracking. "I'm terrified, Ryan. I'm terrified this could cost the whole town its library. I'm terrified of what it means that this man is back in my life at all, even for a week, even under these circumstances. But I learned a long time ago that falling apart doesn't fix anything. So I'm choosing to fight instead." Ryan pulled her into his arms, and for a moment they simply stood there holding on to each other in the quiet of her small kitchen. Two people who had already weathered a diner confrontation. A hostile mother-in-law, a hospital emergency, and a secret nearly torn apart by silence, now facing something that threatened not just their relationship, but Olivia's entire professional life and the town's only library. "We do this together," Ryan said finally. "Every step." "Together," Olivia agreed. The next morning, Mrs. Whitfield confirmed she had in fact overheard the tail end of Grant's conversation with Olivia through her office door. Not everything, but enough. Enough to hear him mention dinner. Enough to hear the tightness in Olivia's voice when she'd refused. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was a start. Olivia spent that evening on the phone, working her way through a list of state library contacts she'd built over her career, asking careful, deliberate questions that revealed slowly and with mounting horror that Grant Sullivan's pattern was not just real, but extensive. A librarian in Cheyenne, who'd left the profession entirely 3 years ago after a funding review that had felt eerily similar. A program coordinator in Gillette, who'd quietly transferred to a different state system rather than deal with him again. Small stories scattered across the state, none of them loud enough on their own to matter, but together forming a shape that was impossible to ignore. By Saturday, Olivia had compiled a folder of documentation corroborating statements and a formal written complaint, and she drove 2 hours to the regional state office in person, rather than risk it disappearing into some internal process Grant might have influence over. She left the folder with a stern-faced regional director named Patricia Alvarez, who read through the first few pages in silence, her expression growing darker with every line, and finally looked up at Olivia with something that looked like grim, weary recognition. "You're not the first," Patricia said quietly. "You're just the first one with the courage to put it in writing and drive it here herself, instead of quietly transferring away like the others did." "I almost didn't," Olivia admitted. "I have someone in my life now who reminded me it was worth the fight." "Good," Patricia said, closing the folder with a decisive snap. Because this is going to end his career, Ms. Bennett. And frankly, it's 5 years overdue. Your library's funding was never actually in jeopardy. That's a lie he's been using to manipulate women for longer than I want to admit. We allowed it to continue. I'll have this handled by Monday. The relief that flooded through Olivia was so overwhelming, she had to sit down for a moment in the hallway outside Patricia's office, tears finally spilling over after days of forcing herself to stay composed, to stay strategic, to stay strong. When she called Ryan from the parking lot afterward, her voice was shaking, but this time it was shaking with something closer to triumph than fear. "It's over," she told him. "The library's safe, and he's not going to be able to do this to anyone else ever again." "You did that," Ryan said, his voice thick with pride. "You did that yourself, Olivia. That took more courage than I've shown in years." "We did it together," Olivia corrected. "You stayed calm when I needed you to, instead of driving to his motel and getting yourself arrested. That mattered more than you know." Grant Sullivan was terminated from his position the following Wednesday, and word moved through the tight-connected network of small-town librarians fast enough that by the time he left Larkspur for the last time, he did so quietly without ceremony, without ever getting the chance to say another word to Olivia at all. But the story of what had happened, carefully, deliberately shared by Mrs. Whitfield, who had never liked feeling helpless in her own library, and was thrilled to have a version of events to tell that ended in justice, spread through Larkspur in a way that finally completely reversed the ugly rumor Dale Pruitt had started weeks earlier. Because now the story wasn't about a heavy librarian scheming after a widower's property. The story was about a woman who had stood her ground against a predator with real institutional power, documented every detail with methodical precision, and won not through anger, not through revenge, but through patience and courage, and an unwillingness to let fear make her decisions for her. Dale Pruitt himself, of all people, showed up at the shop 2 weeks later, hat in hand, looking more uncomfortable than Ryan had ever seen him. "Heard about what happened with that State fella," Dale said, shuffling his feet. "Heard your girl took him down all on her own." "She did," Ryan said, not bothering to hide the pride in his voice. "I was wrong about her." Dale said the words clearly costing him something to say out loud. "What I said back at the diner that was ugly and it wasn't true, and I've been feeling sick about it for weeks, especially after hearing what kind of person she really is. Figured I owed you both an apology." "You don't owe me anything," Ryan said, "but I know exactly where to find her if you want to say it yourself." Dale did eventually, walking into the library one afternoon and mumbling an apology so awkward and sincere that Olivia had laughed despite herself accepting it with more grace than the man probably deserved, because that was simply who she was. Winter deepened over Larkspur through November, bringing with it the kind of quiet, settled peace that only comes after a storm has fully passed. Ryan and Olivia's relationship, tested by rumor, by grief, by extortion, and by every fear either of them had carried into it, had emerged from all of it, not weaker, but immeasurably stronger, built now on a foundation neither of them doubted anymore. Lily's cast came off just before Thanksgiving, revealing an arm slightly pale and thin from weeks in plaster, but fully healed, and she insisted on keeping the cast itself covered in signatures and doodles as what she called a piece of history, propping it proudly on her bookshelf beside her collection of favorite novels. Thanksgiving that year was larger than Ryan's house had seen in 5 years. Diane drove up from Casper, bringing with her a pumpkin pie recipe that had belonged to Sarah's own mother, and insisted over Ryan's mild protest that Olivia learn to make it too, because traditions are meant to grow, not stay locked away in a box. It was Diane, in fact, who raised her glass that evening once dinner was cleared, and the four of them sat together in the warm, crowded kitchen, and said the words that made Olivia cry for the second time that season, though this time entirely from happiness. "I want to say something," Diane announced, standing slightly unsteadily, glass of sparkling cider in hand. "I came to this town in October fully prepared to find every possible reason why this woman wasn't good enough for my daughter's family. I was scared, and I was grieving, and I turned that grief into cruelty I'm not proud of." She looked directly at Olivia, her eyes wet. "Instead, I found someone who has made my granddaughter safer, my son-in-law happier, and this entire family stronger than I've seen it since before Sarah got sick. Olivia, you are not a replacement for anyone. You are simply entirely the right person for this family, exactly as you are, and I am grateful every single day that Ryan had the sense to fall in love with you. Olivia couldn't speak for a long moment, tears spilling freely down her face, and Ryan reached across the table and took her hand, the same gesture that had started everything 6 months earlier in a diner full of strangers who had once believed she wasn't enough. To exactly as you are, Ryan said, raising his own glass, which turns out to be more than any of us ever deserved. To exactly as we are, Lily echoed solemnly, raising her cup of apple juice with the gravity of someone who understood in her own 7-year-old way that something important had just been said. They drank to it together, the four of them, in a warm kitchen on a cold Wyoming night, and outside the window, the first heavy snow of the season began to fall quiet and steady, blanketing the fields in white, as if the whole world had decided finally to rest. But even as Ryan watched Olivia laugh at something Diane said, her whole face lit up with a joy that still sometimes seemed to surprise her. A small, persistent worry sat in the back of his mind, one he hadn't told anyone about yet. Not even her. Because 2 days earlier, alone in his shop office after closing, he had finally opened the folder his lawyer had sent him months ago and never touched the paperwork for a will for guardianship arrangements for exactly the kind of future planning Dale Pruitt's ugly rumor had once falsely accused Olivia of scheming after. And staring at those blank lines waiting for names, Ryan had realized with sudden and overwhelming clarity that there was only one thing left standing between the family sitting around this table tonight and the family he actually wanted to build for the rest of his life. It was time to ask her a question he'd been too afraid to ask anyone in 5 long years. Ryan didn't sleep well that night, not because of anything wrong, but because of everything suddenly terrifyingly right. He lay awake long after Olivia had gone home, and Lily had drifted off surrounded by half-unwrapped Thanksgiving leftovers she'd insisted on keeping for research, staring at the ceiling and turning that folder over and over in his mind, the will, the guardianship lines, the blank space where a name was supposed to go. He knew the name. He'd known it for weeks now if he was honest with himself. He just hadn't let himself write it down yet because writing it down made it real, and real things could still be lost. He called his lawyer, Marcus Feld, first thing Monday morning. "I need to redo the whole thing," Ryan said, sitting in his truck outside the shop before opening hours, the folder open on the passenger seat beside him. "Guardianship, the business, all of it." "All right," Marcus said, unsurprised. He'd been nudging Ryan toward this conversation for over a year. "Who are we naming?" Ryan hesitated for exactly 1 second. "Olivia Bennett." There was a pause on the line, and then Marcus, who had known Ryan since high school and had sat 2 pews behind him at Sarah's funeral, said quietly, "It's about time, Ryan." "I haven't asked her to marry me yet," Ryan said. "I want the paperwork ready before I do it. I want to walk into that conversation already having decided fully without hedging that this is real and permanent, not just something I'm hoping works out." "Smart," Marcus said. "Backwards, but smart. Most men do the ring first and figure out the logistics after." "I've done things out of order my whole life," Ryan said. "Figured I'd try being deliberate for once." He hung up feeling lighter than he had in years, and heavier too, in the particular way that comes from finally admitting to yourself what you actually want out loud to another human being, instead of carrying it silently where it can't be taken from you, but also can't grow into anything real. He didn't tell Olivia. Not yet. He wanted to do this right, and doing it right meant finding a ring and finding the right moment. And if he was honest with himself, working up the nerve to ask a question that terrified him more than anything he'd faced since the day the doctors had told him Sarah's diagnosis was terminal. He should have known better than to think he could keep a secret in Larkspur for more than a week. It started, as these things always seem to in this town, with his cousin Mark at the feed store. "Heard you called Marcus Feld about some paperwork," Mark said, ringing up a bag of fertilizer with entirely too much interest in his voice for a simple transaction. "Guardianship stuff." "That true?" Ryan froze. "How do you know that?" Marcus's receptionist is my wife's cousin, Mark said, grinning. Small towns, Ryan. You know how it is. He leaned across the counter, lowering his voice conspiratorially. You proposing or not? I haven't decided when, Ryan said carefully. That's a yes, Mark said, delighted. Took you long enough. Ryan drove away from the feed store, already dreading the inevitable spread of the news, and sure enough, by that evening, 3 separate people had mentioned to him, with varying degrees of subtlety, that they'd heard something exciting was coming. He didn't dare imagine what version of the story had reached Olivia's ears yet, if any had. He found out the answer sooner than he wanted to. Olivia showed up at his door 2 evenings later than usual. Her face carrying an expression Ryan couldn't immediately place. Not quite upset, not quite happy, something tangled and uncertain in between. Ryan, she said once Lily had gone up to brush her teeth for bed. Mrs. Kowalski stopped me at the grocery store today. She congratulated me. Ryan's stomach dropped. For what? She wouldn't say exactly, Olivia said, watching him carefully. She just said she'd heard wonderful news and couldn't wait to see the ring. Ryan, is there something you want to tell me? For a moment, Ryan considered lying, considered deflecting, considered a dozen small evasions that would buy him the time he needed to do this properly, with the ring already chosen, with the moment already planned out the way he'd imagined it late at night for the past week. But he'd promised her honesty, fully, no exceptions, no matter how inconvenient the timing. I called my lawyer, he admitted, about updating my will. Guardianship paperwork for Lily in case anything ever happened to me. Olivia's face softened slightly, though the uncertainty didn't fully clear. That's a good thing to do, Ryan. Every parent should have that in order. But that doesn't explain why the entire town seems to think we're engaged. I put your name on the guardianship paperwork, Ryan said quietly. And I may have mentioned to Marcus that I was planning to propose, eventually, when the timing was right. I didn't think it would spread this fast. Olivia went very still, her breath catching audibly. You're planning to propose? Ryan realized with a sinking feeling that this was not at all how he'd wanted this moment to unfold. Not in his kitchen doorway, half-finished, forced out by small-town gossip, instead of chosen deliberately on his own timeline. Yes, he said, because there was nothing else true to say. I am. I don't have the ring yet. I wanted everything ready. The paperwork, the guardianship, all of it settled first, so that when I did ask, you'd know it wasn't just a feeling. It would be a decision I'd already fully made in every practical way that mattered. Ryan, Olivia said, her voice trembling now, tears welling despite the awkward, unplanned circumstances. I don't need the paperwork perfect. I don't need a rehearsed moment. I just need to know that you mean it. I mean it, Ryan said, closing the distance between them, taking her face gently in his hands. Olivia, I have meant it since a rainy night on that porch, maybe before that, if I'm honest. I just wanted to do this the right way, and apparently the right way isn't available to us in a town where everybody knows everybody's business before they know it themselves. Olivia laughed through her tears, a wet, startled sound. So is this it? Is this you asking me? Ryan hesitated, torn between the practical man who wanted to do this with a ring, with a plan, with the dignity the moment deserved, and the man standing in front of her right now, overflowing with everything he felt, and unwilling to make her wait one more unnecessary day for an answer he already knew. No, he said finally, gently. This isn't it. When I ask you, Olivia, I want it to be a moment you carry with you for the rest of your life, not something rushed out because Mrs. Kowalski couldn't keep a secret at the grocery store. Give me a little more time, please. Olivia nodded, wiping her eyes. Something deeply moved in her expression, despite the strange backwards way the conversation had unfolded. Okay, she whispered. I can wait. I've waited for the right things my whole life. I can wait a little longer for this. That should have been the end of it. A sweet, slightly chaotic moment, resolved with patience and honesty, the way most of their conflicts had resolved since the porch. But fate, or perhaps simply the accumulated stress of the last several months, had other plans, and the very next morning, Ryan received a phone call, that pulled the ground out from under everything. It was Marcus Feld again, but this time, his voice carried none of the warmth from their last conversation. "Ryan, I need you to come into the office," Marcus said. "Today if you can. It's about the shop." "What about the shop?" "There's a lien filing," Marcus said carefully, "on the property. I need to walk you through it in person." Ryan's chest tightened with a dread he hadn't felt since the year Sarah got sick. "Marcus, just tell me now." Marcus sighed audibly through the phone. "Your father took out a loan against the shop property 15 years ago before you inherited it. Small regional bank, since bought out twice over. Somewhere in all those buyouts, the paperwork on that loan got lost or forgotten or both. It looks like it was never fully paid off before he passed, and the current holding company just found the file. They're calling the note due Ryan, all of it, 90 days. Ryan's hands went cold around the phone. "How much?" $41,000, Marcus said. "Plus accrued interest over 15 years. Closer to 63,000 all told." Ryan sat down hard on the edge of his workbench, the phone nearly slipping from his grip. $63,000 was not a number that existed anywhere in his life. It wasn't in his savings, wasn't in any account he could liquidate fast enough, wasn't a number he could conjure through 90 days of even his most desperate work schedule. "If I can't pay it," Ryan said slowly, "what happens? They foreclose on the property?" Marcus said, his voice heavy with the particular gentleness of a man delivering news he wished he didn't have to. "The shop, Ryan. The land, the building, all of it. I'm sorry. I'm going to fight this every way I know how, but I need you to understand the real possibility here before we go further." Ryan didn't remember hanging up the phone. He didn't remember driving home. He remembered vaguely sitting in his own driveway for nearly 20 minutes, staring at nothing, feeling the entire foundation of the life he'd painstakingly rebuilt after Sarah's death threatening to collapse beneath him at the worst possible moment, right as he'd finally allowed himself to believe in a future worth building. He didn't tell Olivia that night either. Not out of the old instinct to protect her from hard truths he'd learned that lesson too well by now, but because he genuinely didn't know how to say the words yet without his voice breaking completely, and he needed one more night to simply sit with the fear before he asked her to help him carry it. She knew something was wrong the moment she saw his face the next evening. "Ryan," she said, setting down the grocery bags she'd carried in her librarian's instinct for reading small, careful details, immediately picking up on the tightness around his eyes, the way his shoulders sat higher than usual, braced. "What happened?" He told her everything. The lien, the forgotten loan, the 90-day deadline, the $63,000 that might as well have been $1 million for all the difference it made to his actual bank account. Olivia listened without interrupting her expression, growing more focused, more determined with every sentence. And by the time he finished, she had already pulled out her phone and started typing notes. "Okay," she said. "First, does the loan documentation actually hold up? 15 years is a long time for paperwork to survive multiple bank buyouts intact. Marcus needs to demand the complete chain of custody on that note, every transfer, every assignment. If there's a single gap in that chain, the debt might not be legally enforceable at all." Ryan blinked at her. "How do you know that?" "I spent 2 years working part-time at a law library during grad school," Olivia said, not looking up from her notes. "I know enough to know what questions to ask, even if I can't answer them myself. Second, even if the debt is valid, $63,000 over 90 days doesn't have to come from one source. We diversify. Emergency small business loans, a payment plan, negotiation directly with the holding company, maybe even a community fundraiser. This town loves you, Ryan, whether you fully believe that or not. You fixed half their tractors for free when times were hard for them. People remember that kind of thing." "I'm not doing a fundraiser," Ryan said immediately, old pride flaring hot in his chest. "I'm not standing in front of this whole town with my hand out." "Then we find another way," Olivia said, simply undeterred by his resistance. "But Ryan, listen to me. This is exactly the moment you don't get to shut me out and handle it alone. You promised me that already, remember. Protect me by standing beside me, not by carrying things silently until they crush you." Something in Ryan's chest cracked open at that, the old instinct toward isolation finally fully losing its grip. "You're right," he said quietly. "I'm sorry. I sat with this alone for almost a full day before I told you." "I know," Olivia said softer now. "And I understand why. But we're past that now. Okay, whatever this is, we face it together." The next 3 weeks unfolded in a blur of frantic coordinated effort. Marcus filed formal demands for the complete chain of custody on the original loan documentation. Uncovering buried deep in the paperwork a critical gap, an 18-month period during the second bank buyout, where the loan had apparently been sold to a shell entity that had since dissolved without any clear record of where the debt obligation had legally transferred. It wasn't a clean win, not the kind that made the debt disappear entirely, but it was enough leverage to force the holding company into a negotiation they clearly hadn't expected to need. Meanwhile, without Ryan's full knowledge or permission, word had quietly spread through Larkspur about the trouble at the shop. Not through Olivia, who'd respected his wishes about not organizing anything formal, but through Mrs. Whitfield, who mentioned it in passing to a patron, who mentioned it to another, in the same slow, unstoppable way that had once spread Dale Pruitt's ugly rumor across the entire town within days. This time, though, the rumor mill worked in Ryan's favor. Farmers he'd fixed equipment for over the years, sometimes for free, sometimes for whatever they could afford, started showing up at the shop unannounced, pressing folded bills into his hand, insisting it wasn't charity. Just payment finally caught up on old favors. Mrs. Kowalski showed up with a check for $200 and a firm refusal to take no for an answer. Even Dale Pruitt, still working off the guilt of his earlier cruelty, organized an informal collection at the diner that raised nearly $3,000 in a single weekend entirely without Ryan's involvement or consent. "I told everyone not to do this," Ryan said, standing in his shop office staring at an envelope Mrs. Whitfield had just handed him, containing over $4,000 in small, careful contributions from half the town. "You told me not to organize a fundraiser," Olivia said gently. "You never said anything about people organizing themselves. This isn't charity, Ryan. This is a community remembering every kindness you've shown them for years, and finally getting the chance to return it. Let them. Let this be one of the ways you learn that accepting help doesn't make you weak." By the time the 90-day deadline arrived, the combination of the legal leverage Marcus had uncovered, a negotiated reduced settlement with the holding company, and nearly $9,000 in community contributions had brought the crisis down to a manageable monthly payment plan. Ryan could actually sustain, not painless, not easy but survivable, and more importantly, the shop remained his. He sat in his truck, the evening the final papers were signed, staring at the building that had been his father's, before it was his. The building where he'd taught himself to fix engines as a teenager. The building that had nearly slipped through his fingers over a 15-year-old paperwork error nobody had known existed until the worst possible moment. Olivia knocked on his window, and he rolled it down, and she leaned in and kissed him softly, without a word, understanding exactly what this moment meant, without needing it explained. "We did it," she said finally. "You did it," Ryan corrected. "You knew exactly what questions to ask, exactly how to find the crack in their case. I would have just panicked and lost everything. We did it." Olivia repeated firmer this time. "That's what this is, Ryan. That's what a family does. Nobody carries the whole weight alone." It was in that moment, sitting in his truck outside the shop, his family had nearly lost with Olivia's hand resting warm against his cheek, that Ryan finally understood with total and complete clarity that he had already run out of reasons to wait. He drove to Cheyenne the following Saturday, ostensibly for shop supplies, and spent nearly 3 hours in a small, quiet jewelry store owned by a woman named Beatrice, who had remarkably once repaired a watch for his father decades earlier, and remembered the Carter name the moment he introduced himself. "What's she like?" Beatrice asked, laying out a selection of rings across a velvet tray. Ryan thought about the question for a long moment. "She's the kind of person who stands up for strangers, even when it costs her something," he finally said. "She's smarter than almost anyone I've ever met. but she never makes you feel small for not keeping up. She's been hurt by people who couldn't see past the surface of her, and instead of letting that make her bitter, she just got kinder. She saved my daughter's life, once kept her calm during the scariest moment of both our lives, just by telling her a story. She stood up to a man with real institutional power over her career because she refused to let fear make her decisions for her. And she chose me, Beatrice, not despite everything I thought disqualified me, but because of it. Beatrice smiled, sliding one particular ring gently toward him. Not the flashiest one on the tray, not the most expensive, but simple, warm, understated, in a way that felt exactly right the moment Ryan saw it. "That one," Ryan said immediately. He drove home with a small box tucked carefully in his jacket pocket, his heart pounding the entire way, already turning over in his mind exactly how he wanted to do this. Not rushed, not accidental, not forced out by small-town gossip, but deliberate, chosen exactly the way he'd told Olivia it would be. He decided on the old barn. It sat on the back edge of his property, a structure his grandfather had built decades earlier, long since retired from any practical farm use, but a place Ryan had quietly been restoring in his spare hours. Over the past 2 months, new boards replacing the rotted ones. The old hayloft cleared and swept string lights he'd bought without fully admitting to himself why all of it, slowly transforming a forgotten structure into something he hadn't consciously planned, but had somehow instinctively known he was building toward. Lily, it turned out, had noticed the barn project weeks earlier and had drawn her own conclusions with the same unshakable confidence she'd applied to identifying her father's feelings for Olivia back in October. "Is that where you're gonna ask her?" Lily said one evening, watching Ryan hang the last string of lights from the old rafters. Ryan nearly fell off the ladder. "How do you know about that, Dad?" Lily gave him the exact same patient, exasperated look she'd given him months earlier. "You've been weird for weeks, and Grandma called and told me to keep a secret, but then she also told me what the secret was, so I don't think she's very good at secrets." Ryan laughed, despite himself climbing down from the ladder. "Okay. Yes, this is where I'm going to ask her. Are you okay with that?" Lily considered the question with real seriousness. "Can I help plan it?" "I would love that," Ryan said, and meant it completely. Over the following 2 weeks, Lily became Ryan's most enthusiastic and surprisingly capable co-conspirator, insisting on picking out the exact shade of ribbon for the mason jars they'd fill with fairy lights, drawing an elaborate crayon-colored sign that read, "Will you marry my dad?" in careful, determined block letters, and rehearsing with total seriousness exactly what she planned to say when the moment came. "You don't have to say anything, sweetheart," Ryan told her gently. "This is between me and Olivia." "But I want to," Lily insisted. "She's gonna be my mom. I get a say too." Something in that sentence landed in Ryan's chest with unexpected weight. Not the words themselves, which he'd half expected, but the easy, uncomplicated certainty behind them, the complete absence of hesitation or grief in a child who 7 years earlier had lost the only mother she'd ever known before she was even old enough to remember her. He hadn't fully considered until that moment what this moment would mean for Lily, specifically not just a father finding happiness again, but a daughter finally actively choosing a mother for herself deliberately, with full awareness in a way Ryan himself had never quite managed to give himself permission to do, until Olivia had forced the question on that rainy porch months earlier. The night before the proposal, unable to sleep, Ryan sat alone in the barn, string lights glowing softly overhead, running through everything. One final time, the ring in its box. Lily's careful crayon sign propped against a hay bale. The small guitar and fiddle duo he'd hired from 2 towns over to play quietly in the background. The exact words he'd been rehearsing for weeks. He thought about Sarah, allowing himself for the first time in months to sit with her memory without the accompanying guilt that had haunted him for 5 straight years. "I think you'd like her," he said quietly into the empty barn, to no one, to everyone. "I think you'd have been friends. I think you'd want this for me, for Lily." He wiped his eyes, laughing softly at himself, alone in a barn, talking to a memory. "I'm not replacing you. I don't think I ever could. I'm just finally letting myself live again. I hope that's okay." The barn, of course, gave no answer, But somewhere in the quiet, in the soft glow of string lights, he'd hung with his own hands over 2 months of careful, hopeful labor. Ryan felt something settle inside him that had been unsettled for 5 long years. Not closure exactly, but permission. Finally granted by himself to want something more than mere survival. The next morning, he woke before dawn, his heart pounding with a mixture of terror and certainty he'd never quite felt at the same time before, and began preparing for what he sincerely believed would be the most important day of his life. He had no way of knowing, as he ironed his one good shirt, with hands that wouldn't quite stop shaking, that Olivia had woken that same morning to a phone call that would nearly derail everything before the day had even properly begun. The phone rang at 6:40 in the morning, and Olivia almost let it go to voicemail, groggy and half convinced it was a wrong number, until she saw her mother's name lighting up the screen and felt the old familiar spike of alarm that comes from any early call from a parent. "Mom, is everything okay? Olivia." Her mother's voice was tight, careful, the voice of someone delivering news she'd rehearsed on the drive to the phone. "It's your father. He had a heart attack last night. They've got him stable at the hospital in Rock Springs. But Liv, it was close. I need you to know it was close." Olivia's whole body went cold, the room tilting slightly around her. "Is he okay right now?" "Right this second." "He's stable," her mother repeated. "Resting. The doctors say the next 48 hours matter most. I didn't want to scare you, but I also didn't want you finding out secondhand." "I'm coming," Olivia said immediately, already throwing back the covers, already calculating the 4-hour drive to Rock Springs in her head. "I'll leave within the hour." She hung up and sat on the edge of her bed for a moment, her hands trembling, her mind racing through logistics, calling Mrs. Whitfield to cover her shifts, packing a bag, checking the roads for ice, and it wasn't until she was halfway through throwing clothes into a duffel bag that the second wave of realization hit her. Today. It was supposed to be today. She didn't know the details. Didn't know the barn, didn't know about the string lights or Lily's careful crayon sign, but she'd felt something building for weeks now. The careful way Ryan had been acting, the secretive trips to Cheyenne, the way Lily kept almost saying something, and then catching herself with visible effort. Olivia wasn't naive. She knew, in the way you know a storm is coming before the first drop falls, that something significant had been planned, and today somehow felt like the day it had been building toward. And now her father was in a hospital bed 4 hours away, and there was no question in her mind, none at all, about what she had to do. She called Ryan before she could talk herself out of it. "Hey," Ryan answered, his voice carrying an odd, forced brightness that confirmed everything she'd suspected. "Everything okay? You're up early." "Ryan." Olivia's voice cracked despite her best efforts to stay composed. "My dad had a heart attack last night. He's stable, but it's serious, and I need to go to Rock Springs right now." The forced brightness in Ryan's voice vanished instantly, replaced by something urgent and completely present. "Olivia, I'm so sorry. What do you need?" "Do you need me to drive you? I can find someone to watch the shop." "No," Olivia said quickly. "No, you stay with Lily. I can drive myself. I wanted you to know. I don't know how long I'll be gone. I don't know what's happening with anything else right now, Ryan. I just need to get to him." "Go," Ryan said immediately without a shred of hesitation. "Go right now. Don't worry about anything here. Call me when you know more. I love you, Olivia. Drive safe." The words "I love you" landed in Olivia's chest, even through the fog of fear and adrenaline, and she held on to them the entire 4-hour drive to Rock Springs, repeating them silently to herself every time the panic threatened to overwhelm her focus on the icy roads. Ryan hung up the phone and stood in his kitchen for a long moment, staring at nothing. The small velvet box still sitting in his jacket pocket where he'd placed it that morning with such careful hope. The barn sat ready behind his house, string lights glowing softly. Even in the pale morning light, Lily's crayon sign propped exactly where she'd insisted it needed to be, the hired musicians due to arrive in 6 hours. And none of it mattered now, not next to a man he'd never met, fighting for his life in a hospital bed 4 hours away. not next to the woman he loved, driving through icy roads with tears in her eyes. He sat down at his kitchen table and put his head in his hands, and for a moment, old grief and new fear tangled together in his chest until he could barely tell them apart. The memory of another hospital, another phone call, another woman he loved, fighting for something the doctors couldn't fully guarantee. Lily found him there 20 minutes later, still in his pajamas, the ring box now sitting on the table in front of him like an accusation. "Dad!" She climbed into the chair beside him, her small face creased with worry. "Why do you look like that?" "Olivia's dad is very sick," Ryan said gently. "She had to drive to be with him. I don't know when she'll be back." Lily's face fell, her carefully rehearsed excitement crumbling instantly into genuine concern for someone she loved. "Is he going to be okay?" "I don't know yet, baby. We're going to hope so, and we're going to be there for Olivia however she needs us." "What about the barn?" Lily asked in a small voice. "And the lights? And my sign?" Ryan pulled her into his lap, holding her close. "The barn will still be there when the time is right. Some things are more important than a plan, Lily. Right now, the most important thing is making sure Olivia knows we're thinking about her, and that we're ready to help however she needs us whenever she's ready." He spent that day canceling the musicians with as much grace as he could manage quietly without complaint, and calling Diane to ask if she could come stay with Lily on short notice, because something in him already knew with total certainty that wherever Olivia needed him in the coming days, that was exactly where he intended to be. Olivia arrived at Rock Springs Memorial Hospital just after 11 that morning, finding her mother in the family waiting area outside the cardiac unit, looking smaller and more frightened than Olivia had ever seen her. "How is he?" Olivia asked, wrapping her mother in a fierce hug. "Stable," her mother said, her voice thin with exhaustion. "They did a procedure this morning, opened up a blocked artery. The doctor says the next day is critical, watching for complications, but so far, it's holding." They sat together in the waiting room for what felt like an eternity, and it was nearly 2 in the afternoon before a doctor finally emerged to tell them her father was awake, stable, and asking for them both. Olivia's father, a quiet man named Walter, who had spent 30 years working at the same lumber mill, and had never in Olivia's memory shown much outward emotion of any kind, looked pale and small in the hospital bed tubes and monitors surrounding him in a way that made Olivia's chest ache with fear all over again. "There's my girl," he said, his voice weak but warm, reaching out a hand toward her. Olivia took it, tears finally spilling over now that the crisis had shifted from acute terror to the slower, more manageable fear of recovery. "Dad, you scared us half to death." "Wasn't planning on it," Walter said, managing a faint smile. "Doctors tell me I've got some changes to make. Less salt, more walking. Your mother's already planning to police my dinner plate for the rest of my life." "Good," Olivia said, laughing through her tears. "Somebody needs to." They stayed in Rock Springs for 3 days, Olivia sleeping on an uncomfortable pull-out couch in her parents' small house, splitting hospital visits with her mother, calling Ryan every evening to update him, and to hear Lily's voice on speakerphone, insisting on telling elaborate stories about her day at school, that made Olivia laugh despite the exhaustion pressing down on her. It was on the second night, sitting alone in her childhood bedroom, that Olivia finally allowed herself to fully process what she'd interrupted by rushing to her father's side. She called Ryan late after Lily had gone to bed. "I need to ask you something," she said quietly. "And I need you to be honest with me." "Okay," Ryan said, something careful entering his voice. "Was today the day?" Olivia asked. "The barn, the secrecy, all of it, was that supposed to happen today?" There was a long pause on the line. "Yes," Ryan admitted finally. "It was supposed to happen today." Olivia closed her eyes, feeling a complicated wave of emotion move through her grief for the moment, interrupted gratitude that her father was alive and stable, and underneath all of it, a warm, steady certainty about what she wanted to say next. "I'm not sorry I left," she said. "I want you to know that first. I would do exactly the same thing again every single time. And I know you understand that." "Of course I do," Ryan said immediately. Olivia, there was never a version of this where I wanted you anywhere other than by your father's side. The barn will still be there. This isn't about timing. This was never about timing. I know, Olivia said softly. But Ryan, I need you to know something else too. Whatever moment you were planning, whatever you had prepared, none of that actually matters to me. I don't need string lights or a perfect setting. If you asked me the question right now on this phone call in a dark bedroom 4 hours away from you, my answer would be exactly the same as it would have been in whatever beautiful moment you built. Ryan's breath caught audibly through the phone. Olivia, I'm not asking you to do it now, she said quickly. I know you want to do this properly, and I love that about you. I love how much thought and care you put into everything that matters. I just needed you to know that the answer isn't waiting on the setting. It's already decided. It's been decided for a while now. Neither of them said anything for a long moment, the silence full and warm, despite the physical distance between them. I love you, Ryan said, finally, his voice thick. I'll see you soon. Take care of your dad. We'll be right here when you're ready to come home. Walter Bennett was discharged 4 days later with a strict new diet, a bottle of medications, and a stern warning from his cardiologist about stress management that made him roll his eyes the entire drive home from the hospital. Olivia stayed one more day to help her mother adjust to the new routine before finally reluctantly making the 4-hour drive back to Larkspur, exhausted in a way that went deeper than physical tiredness. She hadn't expected Ryan and Lily to be waiting for her in the driveway when she pulled in. Both of them bundled against the cold Lily, practically vibrating with barely contained excitement, despite clear instructions Olivia would later learn not to give anything away. You're home, Ryan said, pulling her into a hug the moment she stepped out of her car, holding her tightly enough that she felt for the first time in days like she could finally exhale fully. I'm home, she agreed, breathing in the familiar comfort of him. How's your dad? Lily asked, tugging on her coat. He's going to be okay, sweetheart. Thank you for asking. Olivia crouched down to hug her properly. I missed you so much. I missed you too, Lily said, and then, unable to contain herself for one more second, despite her father's earlier warnings, blurted out, Dad has a surprise for you, but I'm not supposed to say what it is. Lily? Ryan said, half laughing, half exasperated. I didn't say what it is, Lily protested. I just said there is one. Olivia looked between the two of them, something warm and hopeful settling in her exhausted chest despite everything. Is that so? Not tonight, Ryan said gently, taking her hand. Tonight, you're going to eat something and sleep in your own bed and rest. There's no rush anymore. We have all the time in the world. That night, exhausted and emotionally drained from the week's events, Olivia slept more soundly than she had in days, and when she woke the next morning to the smell of coffee and the sound of Ryan quietly moving around her kitchen, something in her simply finally felt at peace. 3 days later, on a clear, cold Saturday morning, with the sky an almost impossible shade of blue against the snow-covered fields, Ryan asked Olivia to come by the house, mentioning something vague about wanting her opinion on a project in the barn. She should have suspected something the moment she saw Diane's car parked in the driveway, alongside several others she didn't immediately recognize, but exhaustion and the ordinary business of returning to normal life had dulled her instincts just enough that she walked toward the barn with genuine curiosity rather than anticipation. The barn doors were closed when she arrived, soft light glowing faintly from inside through the gaps in the old wood, and the sound of a fiddle playing something slow and warm drifted out into the cold morning air. Ryan, she called, pushing the door open. What greeted her stopped her completely in her tracks. The barn had been transformed. String lights wrapped through every rafter. Mason jars filled with fairy lights lining the walkway. The old hayloft draped with soft fabric that caught the morning light streaming through gaps in the roof. Diane stood near the back with tears already in her eyes. Mrs. Whitfield stood beside her beaming. Even Dale Pruitt stood awkwardly near the entrance, clearly invited, clearly determined to witness this moment as some final act of redemption for the cruelty he'd shown months earlier. And there, standing in the middle of it all, was Lily, holding up her carefully drawn crayon sign that read, "Will you marry my dad?" In bold, determined letters, her face lit up with a joy too big for her small body to contain. Ryan stood beside her, dressed in his one good shirt, his hands visibly shaking, his eyes already wet. "Ryan," Olivia breathed, one hand flying to her mouth. "What is this?" "This was supposed to happen a week ago," Ryan said, his voice thick with emotion. Before everything got interrupted. But I realized something while I was waiting for you to come home, Olivia. The moment was never actually about the lights, or the setting, or the timing being perfect. The moment was always just about this, you and me and Lily choosing each other exactly the way we have been choosing each other since a diner full of strangers watched me do something I never planned to do. He walked toward her, slowly reaching into his jacket pocket, and Olivia's whole body began trembling, as she understood finally completely what was happening. "I told you once that you were too good for me," Ryan said, his voice breaking slightly. "That I was too old, too tired, too broken by grief to be worth choosing. And you looked at me and told me that was exactly why you chose me. I've spent months thinking about that moment, Olivia, and I've realized something important. You were right. Every single thing I thought disqualified me from happiness turned out to be exactly what led me to you. My grief taught me how precious love actually is. My tiredness taught me to recognize someone who could carry weight beside me instead of adding to it. Every broken piece of me somehow fit perfectly against every broken piece of you, and together we didn't just survive, we built something neither of us thought we'd ever have again." He dropped to one knee, and the barn went completely silent, except for the soft fiddle music still playing in the background and the sound of Diane quietly crying near the back wall. "Olivia Bennett," Ryan said, opening the small velvet box to reveal the simple warm ring he'd chosen weeks earlier in Cheyenne. "You saved my daughter's life with nothing but your voice and a story about a fox. You stood up to a man with real power over your career because you refused to let fear make your decisions. You looked at every reason I gave you to walk away and chose to stay, instead fully, completely, exactly the way you asked me to choose you. I don't have anything left to offer you that isn't already a little worn down by life, but everything I have, everything I am is yours if you'll have it. Will you marry me?" For a long moment, Olivia couldn't speak at all, tears streaming freely down her face, her hands pressed against her mouth, looking down at this man who had once believed himself unworthy of being chosen. Kneeling in a barn, he'd transformed with his own hands into something beautiful, surrounded by a small community that had once doubted her and now stood witness to the truth neither of them had ever needed anyone else to confirm. "Yes," she finally managed, the word breaking apart into a sob of pure joy. "Yes, Ryan, of course yes." Ryan rose and slid the ring onto her trembling finger, and the barn erupted into applause and cheering. Lily, throwing herself at both of them in a fierce hug, still clutching her crayon sign, tears of her own now mixing with her laughter. "I told you she'd say yes," Lily announced to the room at large, with the total, unshakable confidence of a 7-year-old who had never once doubted the outcome. Diane crossed the barn to embrace them both, her earlier hostility from months before now a distant, fully forgiven memory. "Welcome to the family," she whispered to Olivia, her voice thick with tears, properly, officially, and completely. The wedding took place the following spring in that same barn, transformed once more, this time with wildflowers gathered from the surrounding fields, instead of winter's fairy lights, though a few strings of lights remained overhead as a quiet nod to the night of the proposal. Olivia walked down a simple aisle of scattered petals in a modest white dress that fit her exactly as she was, proudly, without a single moment of the old shame that had once made her shrink from being seen. She had spent years believing that love required her to become someone smaller, someone different, someone shaped to fit expectations that were never actually about her at all. Standing in that barn, watching Ryan's face as she approached, watching Lily beam from her position beside him, as the flower girl and the world's proudest almost daughter, Olivia finally completely understood what she had always suspected but never quite believed until now, that she had never needed to change a single thing about herself to be worthy of exactly this. "I thought you deserved someone better," Ryan whispered to her, as they stood together at the altar, echoing words from that rainy porch so many months ago. "I never wanted better." Olivia whispered back, tears of pure happiness in her eyes. "I wanted someone real. I found him." Lily hugged them both fiercely, as their small community of friends and family applauded snow, long since melted wildflowers blooming across the Wyoming fields in every direction, a new season beginning in every sense that mattered. Years later, the story of Ryan Carter and Olivia Bennett would still be told around Larkspur, how a single father who believed he'd used up his chance at happiness found it again in a librarian. Everyone else had underestimated how a town's cruelty had been transformed slowly and deliberately into genuine community, how two broken people had discovered that love was never about finding someone perfect, but about finding someone whose imperfections fit honestly against your own. Ryan Carter had once believed that surviving was the most he could ask of life. Olivia Bennett had once believed that being loved required becoming someone she wasn't. Together in that small Wyoming town, surrounded by people who had learned alongside them exactly what real love looked like, they proved both of those beliefs wrong, permanently, completely, and for the rest of their lives. Real love was never about becoming thinner, richer, younger, or more impressive. It was about two people finally choosing to stop apologizing for exactly who they were, and in that choice, building something that no rumor, no grief, no fear, and no obstacle life could throw at them would ever be strong enough to break.